And then, they'd play benefit concerts for homeless shelters. They'd want to be citizens in the community. And that's kind of where Street Symphony took root, because, they would play benefit fundraisers for a homeless shelter. And I'd look out at this half empty church and be like, well, if we're playing to raise money for a shelter, why aren't we just playing for the people who, we're supposed to be serving? Like, they're next door. Why don't we just go over and play for them? And I think part of that also was formed by spending time in laboratories. I had spent time with some top scientists who would ask really brave questions, come up with a hypothesis, and then test that hypothesis in a laboratory. And the laboratory wasn't just the controlled scientific environment of trying out a premise. The laboratory was a series of relationships, right? They'd try out an experiment. They wouldn't really know what that experiment meant, so they'd go to a mentor, they'd go to another person who ran the same experiment, or they'd call up a colleague across the country who had just published that method and say, what is this stuff? What do I do with this? I think I approached Street Symphony the same way. My hypothesis was, could there be a healing element to making music for people who didn't have access to the concert hall? Was it worth playing music directly for an audience who we said we were committed to helping?
Yeah.
And eventually, when we started reaching out to clinics and shelters and eventually county jails and state prisons, social workers and caseworkers would tell us the best time for therapy was right after a Street Symphony concert, because that's when people wanted to talk. And we were at the beginning, we were playing classical chamber music. We were playing Beethoven and Mozart and all the music written by all the dead white guys. And I would think, we're playing mostly for poor Black people here. Like, is this the right music? Like, is this the right thing? And immediately after, sometimes in the middle of a movement, someone would stand up in a mental health clinic in Skid Row, someone who was clearly experiencing a really rough time in their lives. And they'd be like, I hear it. I hear that music. I know my childhood because I hear it in that music. Like, I can hear my parents screaming at each other in that music. I can hear them beating the crap out of my little sister. I can hear my mom tucking me into bed at night. And, in that moment, that person's story became real. That person's story became more than the condition of homeless, mentally ill, raving lunatic. That person became a story, became a person. And in that moment, Beethoven's pain became real, because that piece she was hearing was written right around the time that Beethoven was considering taking his own life. And then the stories of the performers became real, because I had a childhood that also had chaos in it. My colleagues sometimes were grappling with addiction and mental illness in their own families, in their own lives. So this music kind of became a vessel, an entry point for us to be having a different kind of conversation, and even a different kind of conversation that couldn't happen on stage at Walt Disney Concert Hall. At the concert hall, the music was a product, right? In Skid Row, the music was an invitation. It was an entry point. It was the key to getting to know each other beyond our labels. And I think that also allowed us to acknowledge, and again, gently look at the pain that we might all be carrying, and realize that all of us have a story. All of us have something to say and something to contribute to the world.
What's super interesting about that, and two things I connected that I think are super interesting. One, in the story that you tell overall of your childhood and all the steps through it, in some ways, I think that's a beautiful way to articulate what we were trying to articulate before, what is that feeling of your soul, that wholeness, that feeling. Because I could, at least as I was listening to it, you feel the ups and downs of that story you're telling. You feel the stress and the tenseness of, what are my parents going to think? And I need to try this. And I'm going to college at 13 and I'm doing my first audition. And what you were describing before, that feeling of release and freeness, it's almost like the contrast to that. In that story, you could feel all the stress contrasted with what you're talking about now, which is when you feel like, I finally have a sense of who I am and what I should be doing. And again, that's the journey so many people have to take to get there. But I think it might help people appreciate what that feeling of getting there is a bit. And I also think it's interesting, your point about the music, and in that same vein of not being able to articulate it, it sounds like the music for many people is that person, I think you said was a woman from Skid Row. She probably had been trying in some way to explain her feelings in her own mind and what it was, but couldn't, because words didn't do it justice. But the music, somehow it clicked and it made it feel like, okay, now I can put a better sense of what this is. I could do something with this now. And I think that's interesting to tie back to where you were before.